So, a good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm so sorry that the circumstances are such that I am filling in. But Bezrat Hashem, everyone should have a refuah shalema, and in Mirza Hashem feel good. So, the rabbi asked me to deal with one of the unique aspects of this year. I've already spoken about the Purim SEUDAH in and of itself. What time should we have it? But I thought that the question that came up from the crowd was a fascinating one, and that is the following. We have an obligation to eat a SEUDAH on Friday for Purim. We have an obligation Friday night to eat a SEUDAH for Shabbos. Maybe we could make one of them a little less than usual, not a full course meal. In other words, we understand Friday night we need lechem mishneh, we need bread, we need to have a proper SEUDAH. But who says that on Purim you need to have such a big SEUDAH? So every Friday, every one of you eats whatever you eat before Shabbos. Maybe that suffices for a Purim SEUDAH. And maybe you'll even sing a song about Purim, get a little tipsy, eat a Humintashen, and we can call it quits. In other words, the question I'm going to deal with is, do we need bread at the SEUDAH of Purim on Friday? And number two, do we need meat? So in order to deal with this question, we go right to the source sheet on the top, to Maseches Brachos. Maseches Brachos deals with the following question. So Rosh Chodesh comes, Ta'ava lo hiskir shel Rosh Chodesh b'tefillah. You forgot Ya'aleh v'yavo either in Shachris or Mincha. Machzirin oto, you have to go ahead and fix it by repeating your Shmoneh Esrei. B'Birkat HaMazon, but if you forget it in benching, then en Machzirin oto, you don't have to go ahead and repeat the benching just because you forgot Ya'aleh v'yavo. So Amalei Rav Avin Rav Amram. So Rav Avin says to Rav Amram, Mashna Tefillah, Mashna Birkat Hamazon. It's the same Rosh Chodesh, the same day. If you forget Ya'aleh v'yavo in davening, you have to fix it. But if you forget Ya'aleh v'yavo in benching, you don't have to fix it. Amarle, Aflididi Kashile, I'll be honest with you, I also don't understand it. V'shalti Rav Nachman, and I asked Rav Nachman, Amarle, and Rav Nachman said to me, Mine de Marshmuel lo shmiali. From Mar Shmuel, I didn't hear an answer. So maybe we have to think of it on our own. So let's think of it on our own. So I find this Gemara fascinating, that indeed our rabbis are honest, and they said we didn't know the answer, we asked, and we didn't get a good answer. So therefore, we are going to have to come up with an answer ourselves. Rabbis also don't always have answers for every question. And indeed, you can also think for yourself. Two beautiful lessons from this Gemara, even before we get to the content. Now, getting to the content. Tefillah dechovahu machzirinoto. Davening is an obligation. You have to daven Shachris, you have to daven Mincha. So if it's an obligation, then the Ya'aleh v'yavo becomes an obligation, and you have to go ahead and fix it if you didn't say it. But Birkat Mazona, but benching on Rosh Chodesh, di ba'yachil, di ba'lo achil. You can't fast on Rosh Chodesh, but who says you need to eat a bagel? So therefore, en machzirinoto. What the Gemara basically does is gives the following equation. If there's an obligation to eat a meal with bread, then the additions become obligatory as well. If there isn't an obligation to eat a meal with bread, then the additions are not obligatory as well. So Rosh Chodesh does not have an obligatory obligation to eat bread, and therefore, if you forget Ya'aleh v'yavo, you don't have to fix it. Shabbos, the first two meals for sure, has an obligation to eat bread. So if you forget Ritzei, you have to go ahead and repeat it. And indeed, the Gemara says, Elamayata, according to this, Shabbatot v'yamim togim, delo sagi delo achil, it's impossible on Shabbos and Yantiv not to eat. Hachanami di'itai hadar, is it indeed true that you have to go ahead and fix it? Amar le'in, indeed. Amar Rav Shela, Amar Rav, and indeed Rav Shela said in the name of Rav, Ta'a chozer larosh. If you forget Ya'aleh v'yavo on Yontif or Ritzei on Shabbos, you have to fix it. Comes along the Rosh on this Gemara, Rabbeinu Asher. Rabbeinu Asher, as everybody knows, was a chavrusa with the Mordechai that was killed al Kiddush Hashem. He was a student of the Maharami Rutenberg that was taken captive. You probably all know the story. The Rosh was successful in actually escaping Germany to the Sephardic community, stayed by the Rashba for 3 months. I'm sure they had a wonderful time together. Eventually, he said to the Rashba, I don't want to eat my food for free. Get me a job. And he got a job in Toledo. And he was an Ashkenazi rabbi in the Sephardic community. And Baruch Hashem, today, there are many people like that. One of the people that I respect greatly is Rabbi Jachter, who was a world-class Talmid Chacham, not to mention a world-class expert on Gittin and on Eruvin, two very sophisticated parts of halacha. He is a Sephardic He is an Ashkenazic rabbi in a Sephardic shul, continuing the tradition from the Rosh. So comes along the Rosh and says, Shabbatot v'yamim tovim, on Shabbos and Yantiv, de lo sagile, de lo achal pat. There's no way you can fulfill your obligation without bread. Achanami de mahadar. And indeed, you have to repeat your benching if you forget Ritzeh or Ya'aleh v'yavo. Mashmahacha, from here we learn, to be Yantiv on Yantiv, lo sagya de lo achal pat. It's impossible to think of a Yantiv where you don't eat bread. Now comes the question. Everybody here agrees that on Yantiv you need to eat bread, but the question is, why? Why is it that on Yantiv you have to eat bread? So Shabbos, everybody agrees, Lechem Mishneh, but why on Yantiv do you need to eat bread? Comes along the Ma'adanei Yantiv, which is a Perush on the Rosh, by the famous Tosfos Yontiv, the famous Rav Yom Tov Lipman, who eventually became the chief rabbi of Krakow after the Bach, Rav Yoel Sirkis, died, and he explains the Chayav le'echol pat b'Yontiv mishum simcha. The obligation of simcha, of happiness on Yontiv, v'samachta b'chagecha, obligates amongst different things to eat bread. And even though we have a famous rule, en simcha ela bebasar, that simcha comes through meat, klomar de basar have simcha, aval vadai de pat, bai bahade. It's impossible to think that you're going to eat flesh without bread. So what obligates you to eat bread on Yantiv? The mitzvah of simcha. Based on this ma'adanei Yantiv, if indeed we are obligated in Yemei Mishteh B'Simcha on Purim, that would obligate us to eat bread. But Rabbi Akiva Eger disagrees. Rabbi Akiva Eger has a famous tshuva. Everybody knows it because it's the first tshuva in the book. And he talks about the difference between men and women when it comes to the obligation of Yantiv. Not going into the intricacies of that particular tshuva, I just want to extrapolate this particular aspect from Rabbi Akiva Eger. Rabbi Akiva Eger says that eating bread on Yantiv is not because of simcha. If it would be because of simcha, he says, then you would have to eat bread on Chol HaMoed. But there is no obligation to eat bread on Chol HaMoed. And Chol HaMoed is a time of V'samachta b'chagecha. Therefore, says the Rabbi Akiva Eger, and I quote his words, that ultimately to fulfill the mitzvah of simcha, you do it through wine, through meat, through other things. But bread is an obligation not because of simcha. After all, on Shabbos, we have to eat bread, and there's no obligation of simcha on Shabbos. It does not cancel avelos. Ela denireh demin kvod Shabbat likvos SEUDAH lechem v'hakibud ve'oneg in simcha trei milininu. We have three different things that we're obligated in on Yantiv, and you can't get them mixed up. One is kavod, one is oneg, and one is simcha. One is going ahead and preparing for the day before the day. One is enjoying the day on the day, and one is simcha. And don't get them mixed up. Simcha is basa v'yayin. But kavod ve'oneg would be the weird things that would obligate you in bread. Based on this, since there's no mitzvah of kavod ve'oneg on what we call Purim, there's Yemei Mishteh V'Simcha, but there's no obligation to eat bread. Therefore, says Rabbi Akiva Eger, you do not have to eat bread probably on Purim. Because after all, it's like Chol HaMoed. There's a mitzvah of simcha, and a mitzvah of simcha in and of itself does not obligate you to eat bread. So based on this in our minds, that when there's an obligation to eat bread, you have to repeat the addition. And we basically have a machlokes between the Tosfos Yom Tov and Rabbi Akiva Eger. If the obligation to eat bread is because of simcha, which would obligate us to eat bread on Purim, where we have an obligation of simcha, or because of kavod ve'oneg, which would mean you do not have to eat it on Purim. Now we get to the actual sugya. So there's a famous Gemara in Psachim that talks about Mar Barei de Rabina, that would fast the entire year. Don't ask me how he did this, but he had a few days he didn't fast. And what were the days he didn't fast? Levar me'artzarta, he didn't fast on Shavuos, Puria on Purim, Umala Yoma de Kippur, on Erev Yom Kippur. Why didn't he fast on Purim? Because it says Yemei Mishteh V'Simcha. So everybody agrees you can't fast on Purim. Even Mar Barei de Rabina, that would go ahead and fast every day of the year, did not fast on Purim. So indeed, based on this, ask Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and Yechaveh Da'at, Ha'im choval lasot seudat Purim bepat? Do you have to have bread at the Purim SEUDAH? And a corollary of this, just like we learned, is if you need to have bread, then if you forget Al Hanisim, what's the halacha? You'd have to repeat it. But if you don't have to have bread, then the addition is not obligatory, and therefore you wouldn't have to repeat Al Hanisim. The Pri Megadim says there's a machlokes about this, and indeed, I would say there's 3 points of view. The first point of view is the Rav Yo. The Rav Yo is one of the Rishonim of Ashkenaz, and basically he says exactly the equation we said earlier, and he puts the two together. There's an obligation to eat bread on Purim. Number 2, if you forget Al Hanisim, you have to repeat it at your SEUDAH because there's an obligation to eat bread. And indeed, he explains, Rosh Chodesh, you don't have to eat bread, but Purim, yes. The one who agrees with him is the Meiri. The Meiri is not Ashkenaz, it's Provence. And the Meiri says, Rosh Chodesh v'chol Shemoed, indeed are 2 times where ibai achil, ibai lo achil, you don't have to eat bread. But on Shabbos and Yantiv, you need it for Kriyat SEUDAH. And he adds, V'chein asur bePurim. It's shekatuv bo yemei mishteh. On Purim, not only can't you fast, you also have to eat bread on Purim. He's not exactly clear in the Meiri and Psachim, but what is in the Meiri and Beitza, but in the Meiri and Psachim, he spells it out. Shabbatot v'yamim tovim, eino yachol latzet bahem b'minei tirgema. It's not enough on Shabbos and Yantiv just not to fast and to snack. Ela tzarich kfiyut SEUDAH. You need to have a real meal. Ve'en kfiyut SEUDAH ela bepat. Not only do you need to have a real meal, but the real meal only can happen if you have bread. So based on this Meiri and the Rav Yo, we need to have bread at the SEUDAH of Purim. That's the only way we fulfill the mitzvah of SEUDAH, because Kviat SEUDAH means bread. And indeed, the Maharshal, who functioned exactly at the same time with the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch, but had a different methodology, basically says, if you forget Yala Al Hanisim, and based on the equation we said before, since you have an obligation to eat bread, you also have an obligation to go ahead and fix your benching by repeating it and saying, Al Hanisim, im shachach al Hanisim Seudat Purim yired shetzarich lachzor, v'chen nimtza b'Mordechai v'chtav yad, shehigia gdol b'daro, Morenu Harav Yaakov Polak Zal. I don't know who that is, but indeed he quotes this Morenu Harav. Obviously, he was a great, great rabbi that he respected greatly, and he explained, Shabbos v'Yontiv v'Purim, de lo sagi de lo achil maksirin. On Shabbos, Yontiv, and Purim, there's no such thing as not eating. You need to have a SEUDAH, and therefore, not only do you need to have bread, but if you forget the addition, you have to fix it. And then he explains that Seudat Purim is even on a higher level because it's Chazal, and Chazal always did everything to make their words even more stronger, even more enhanced than the words of the Torah, because people had this tendency to mizalzel in the words of Chazal. And therefore, says the Maharshal, that if on Shabbos and Yantiv this is the case, and all this more so Purim, which is a takana of Chazal, and Chazal were very machmir on their takanos. And indeed, he says, if on Shabbos you need it, then for sure for Purim you need it. The Magen Avraham indeed agrees with the Maharshal and says on his Perush in the Shulchan Aruch, V'im shachacha anisim miberkat hamazon, machzirin oto de lo sagi de lo hachil. Quoting the Rashal, in the name of the Repolak, indeed, if you forget Al Hanisim, you have to repeat it because there's an obligation to eat bread. Rav Yaakov Emden comes along and agrees and says he doesn't understand the people that said you don't need bread. It's impossible to hear, in my opinion. Lo sagi below pat. There's no such thing as having a SEUDAH without bread. The Aruch HaShulchan in the 20th century agrees. I saw that there's some people that have this suffix, if you could fulfill your obligation without bread. And I, little me, think that you do not fulfill your obligation without bread. So make a long story short, there's a whole bunch of poskim starting from the Rav Yah going down to the Meiri. an opinion that the Maharshal stands by, that the Magen Avraham quotes, and indeed Rabbi Yaakov Emden and the Aruch HaShulchan can't see it any other way, that on Purim, to have a kfiyat SEUDAH, to have a meal, you must have bread. Without bread, it is not considered a meal. Impossible. However, there is a descending point of view, and that's the Rabbi Akiva Eger that I mentioned earlier. But in order to introduce Rabbi Akiva Eger, let's first introduce the Rambam. The Rambam says that on Chol HaMoed and Chanukah and Purim, if you forget Al HaNisim, you do not have to fix it. And the Shulchan Aruch basically quotes that you say Al HaNisim Birkat HaMazon, and most poskim say you don't have to go ahead and fix it, which would, again, going back to our equation, mean that there's no obligation to eat bread. If there was an obligation to eat bread, the addition becomes obligatory. And there's two ways to understand the Rambam. One is to say that the Rambam is talking about a law in Hilchos Tefillah, nothing to do with the question of bread. And that's the way the Trumas Hadeshin does. He basically says that Al HaNisim was never obligatory, and therefore it can't be obligatory at the SEUDAH. It was a nice addition to the bracha of Modim, but quite frankly, we say Modim anyway, we thank God anyway. And therefore, says the Trumas Hadeshin, that it has nothing to do with the question of bread. He doesn't even deal with the question of bread. He basically says, if you forget Al HaNisim, you don't have to fix it. And the reason is, and I quote, that ultimately it's a reshut. It's an actual, not an obligation, but an option to say Al HaNisim. If you don't say Al HaNisim, as I explained in my book, Davening Your Age, you've already said thank you. You just didn't say thank you very much. That is the opinion of the Trumas Hadeshin. But based on Rabbi Akiva Eger that we saw earlier, Rabbi Akiva Eger was very, very strong in saying that kavod ve'oneg are the reasons to have bread, and simcha is not. Based on that, since on Purim we have a mitzvah of simcha, then obviously you don't have a mitzvah to have bread per se. The Magen Avraham that we quoted earlier in the name of the Rashal actually says Medina, in his opinion, Nirali, I think, the lo lamed machzirinoto. You don't have to repeat Al HaNisim. Ki lo matzinu shechayav lechol pat bepurim. We never saw that you have to eat bread on Purim. Umatzah the mifter nafshe b'shar minei matamim, and you can fulfill the mitzvah of SEUDAH with a homin tashin and with other things that ultimately fill you up. You do not need bread. The Birkei Yosef, the Chida, agrees. And he says, "Imasa sudat Purim below lachem yatsa," and he quotes some kadosh b'tshuva from some ktav yad, and therefore, if you don't say Al HaNisim, it's okay. And the Eliyahu Rabbah basically agrees, mikol makom ein chiyuv pat. So at the end of the day, when all the dust settles, we actually have three opinions. Opinion number one is that you need to have bread at the SEUDAH. Opinion number two is you do not need to have bread. And opinion number three is, I don't really know, but you don't repeat Al HaNisim. In other words, opinion number one that says you need to have bread says you also have to repeat Al HaNisim. Opinion number two that says you don't have to have bread, obviously, is you don't have to repeat Al HaNisim. Opinion number three says you don't have to repeat Al HaNisim even if you have to have bread. Why? Because Al HaNisim was always an option. La halacha, the Mishnah Berurah comes along and says it's a machlokas if you forgot Al HaNisim, and safek brachot lahakel, and therefore if you forgot Al HaNisim, you do not have to repeat it, and Rav Ovadia Yosef agrees. So when it comes to bread, it seems like a very, I would say, balanced machlokas. Do you need bread at the SEUDAH to fulfill the mitzvah of simcha or not? And ultimately, it's a balanced machlokas. But when it comes to meat, it seems a little unbalanced. When it comes to meat, the Rambam is very explicit. How do you fulfill the mitzvah? You need to have meat, says the Rambam. The Shulchan Aruch says that even if you're in aninut, before the burial of a loved one, of one of the seven relatives, you may be able to eat meat because indeed, Purim is not a d'oraisa, but it's written in the Tanakh. And since it's written in the Tanakh, it has a status of what we call divrei Kabbalah. And says the Shulchan Aruch, it could very well be that even an Onein that usually can't eat meat can eat meat on Purim because it's a mitzvah that everyone's obligated in. So when it comes to meat, it seems pretty clear, and there's not a lot of dissenting opinions, that you need to have meat. So to make a long story short, Friday SEUDAH is indeed a very big challenge when it comes to the issue of bread very, very balanced machlokes. But when it comes to meat, it seems pretty clear that if you have meat at your Yontif Seudot, then for sure you need to have it on Purim. And indeed, the Pri Megadim says that someone that's in Aninut, Basar V'yayin Bayam Mutar Michamat Asay de Purim, night of Purim, no, but during the day, yes. So to make a long story short, with regard to bread, we have what to talk about, but not with regard to meat. It seems pretty clear that when it comes to meat, indeed the Seudah must have meat. Does this help with the appetite Friday night? I guess it depends how many meat and potatoes you're going to eat. Thank you all very much for listening.